I have one final kind of question for this initial interview. And that is we've heard some concerns like, wow, if we put this new governance model in place, will congregants lose their power or influence if the minister has all the responsibility to handle decisions and programs and activities? So how does this model support shared leadership in your viewpoint?
Well, first of all, I think that's a very smart thing for you to be worried about, because you've had a lot of transition in the role of minister. And so when we talk about what, if anything, the board will give over to the minister and make the minister responsible for, it's a little tricky to talk about that with confidence because we don't know who we're talking about. You haven't formed a relationship with that person yet.
Right.
And in fact, if that person were there today on their first day, the first thing I would say is don't make big changes, because it makes sense to save at least part of this whole process for after that positive relationship has been established. So it's absolutely a good question. But let me answer in terms of that you asked it. Shared ministry happens in a couple of ways after it's clear what the minister is responsible and accountable for. Number one, the minister and the board to have their relationship with one another, an ongoing conversation that's not just about policy and accountability reporting and so on. It's also about feedback and relationship building in behalf of the whole congregation. The minister, the president, the congregation, the board have a relationship that I think is a signal to the rest of the congregation, either that all is well or that all is not well. You've perhaps experienced both of those in living memory. So that's one way. Another is that this conversation that I talked about the future, the minister is a full partner in that, in my view. That's not just something the board does on its own. In fact, there's almost nothing the board does on its own in the sense of apart from its relationship with the minister. I think the minister should be at the table. Voting or not is a secondary question. The other is, and I think this gets closer to what people usually are most concerned about, is that within the area of what I call ministry, which is the practical work day to day of the church, in most congregations, especially smaller ones, there are groups of people who operate essentially autonomously. And one of the structural ways that that's expressed is that this is a committee that reports to the board. A board doesn't really have much capacity to supervise practical work, much less do it. So what tends to happen is that there are groups that operate pretty much unsupervised and pretty much outside of any influence from a larger congregational sense of direction. That may be exaggerating the point a little bit. And I don't mean at all that the things they're doing are bad. They might be, of course, but oftentimes, particularly where there's been a lot of ministerial transition, the work of those subgroups is what helps the congregation to weather that transition. And so what I would imagine, knowing almost nothing about you, is there may be groups that are deeply appreciated and leaders who are deeply appreciated for having kept your congregation strong. I mean, you've done extraordinary things for a congregation without the kind of long-term ministerial leadership that some other congregations have, and that I hope perhaps you'll have in the future. So the sense of partnership that's probably most important to people, that'll take the longest to shape up and really make real in a new governance model, would be the partnership between the minister and paid staff who are responsible for the very things that these committees and other groups in the congregation do. And that can be played out as people might fear and imagine, as a command and control kind of relationship. It happens. Most of us have experienced that at work, but it doesn't have to. And to me, part of the relationship between the board and the minister, as it shapes up during the first 3-4 years of your next ministry particularly, will be to develop a style of leadership by that minister that supports partnership, where people feel empowered and resourced, and actually more potentially more empowered to be creative as leaders of subgroups of the congregation than they do now. Now, again, I don't know, I can't criticize, but I'll say in many congregations, it's very difficult for a lay leader to get the decisions made that make it possible to do anything that hasn't been done before, to get new money approved, to get new room assignments assigned, to get permission to do something very different is really quite difficult when you might have to go to 3 or 4 committees and the board to get it done. Whereas an advantage for lay leaders of having a clearer structure for decision making in ministry is that it can become easier to get permission and empowerment to do things that align with the overall direction the congregation has chosen.
Wow.
Yeah, what I find, once you get the structure designed, and you're in this process somewhere,
Yeah.
and the person in that minister role getting in place is a really critical piece. And then taking whatever structures you have now for getting things done and trying to organize them into some unified structure for decision making in ministry. Oftentimes people do enter that with a sense of apprehension about it being less creative or less free, or that they'll be less honored. But what I find is that if it goes well, which it often does, there's a point where people get quite excited about how supple and nimble a structure can be when it has a clear way of making each decision, a clear place where each buck stops. And that's a wonderful thing to see. I like to be in the room when that light dawns.
Okay, well, thank you. This is a great opportunity for our congregants to get to know you a little bit more and more about some of the work that we're doing and that's ahead of us. So,
thank you, Wendy. I'm glad to have a chance, and greetings to everyone in the congregation.